Welcome to the Kirin True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I am Robert Stockman, director of the center, and joining me today are three speakers: Sahba Shayani, Negar Mottahedeh, and Sasha Dehghani. And they authored, three of the recently published papers about Tahirih in a special edition of the journal Hawwa, Journal of Women in the Middle East and the Islamic World. That edition was titled "From the Seed of Love We Sow." Sasha Dehghani's paper is available free online at the journal's website, so I'm told, and the other papers, unfortunately, are behind a paywall, as is standard of academic journals nowadays. Our first author is Sahba Shayani, who is a lecturer in Persian language at the University of California in Los Angeles. He has bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from UCLA. Prior to his return to UCLA in January of 2023, he taught as senior lecturer in Persian language at the University of Oxford from 2015 to 2023. He has been involved in Persian language pedagogy at various levels since 2005. His research focuses on the role of women in pre-modern Persian epic romance poetry. He recently published the article "Literary Imitation in 3 Poems Attributed to Tahirih Qurrat al-Ain" in this journal Hawwa, and we will be hearing about that particular paper right now. So I want to welcome our three presenters today and thank them for joining us. And I will now remove our other speakers and put Sahba's presentation up so we can get started. And I'll remove myself as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sahba. I really appreciate your participation in this panel.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak on one of the most prominent figures of world history, I would really say. Tahirih Qurrat al-Ain is truly an inspiration to all of us. So as Rob said, my presentation will be on Tahirih's poetry, or the poetry attributed to Tahirih, and the subject of literary imitation. I will talk about my paper and share some of the poems on here, and I'll share the poems on the PowerPoint. So, ba ijazat. Tahirih Qurrat al-Ain, born as Fatemeh Baraqani in either 1814 or 1817 or 18, not only left behind a legacy as a revolutionary religious thinker and a prominent Bahá'í leader, but also one as a woman of literary prowess in both prose and poetry. In regards to her poetic output, proving the authenticity of these works is often a philological challenge, a question which is further complicated by a lack of early manuscripts of her writing and her being a woman and an ardent Bahá'í. In Persian literary history, female poets have often been discredited of their work because of a scarcity of primary sources and traditional socio-religious perspectives on women's roles, as seen in the cases of some of Tahirih's literary predecessors, such as Mahsati Ganjavi, who wrote in the 12th century, Jahan Malek Khatun, who wrote in the 14th century, and even her literary successors, such as Parveen Etesami, who lived in between 1907 and 1941, and Furugh Farrokhzad, who wrote in the 50s and 60s. Even when the authenticity of their work is accepted, these poets and their works are often belittled because of their gender. Tahirih's transgression, so to say, exceeds that of her predecessors, however, in that not only is she a woman active in a male-dominated field of writing, but also that she is the daughter and the niece and ex-daughter-in-law of 2 renowned Usuli clerics, and a woman who had, as a result of her conversion first to the Shaykhi movement and then the Bahá'í religion, left her family to propagate the message of her newfound faith. As a result of such transgressions, Tahirih not only suffered throughout her life and was ultimately executed, but even her memory has and continues to suffer the attempts of erasure and censure at the hands of those who, whether because of her religious affiliation, her gender, or both, attempt to rob her of her historical and literary legacy. Both in the East and the West, a variety of reasons are often conjured to prove why specific female writers do not compose what is attributed to them, or even if they did compose it, why it's not of high quality. And while Tahirih's knowledge and eloquence have been acknowledged by friend and foe alike, she has not been spared such maledictions. At times, poems that have been traditionally attributed to her are without concrete evidence dismissed as misattributions and coupled with baseless ridicule of the very movement for which she gave her life, the Bahá'í faith. On other occasions, works attributed to her are modified to remove her nom de plume and any hint of her or her Bahá'í beliefs, and that are also erased from it, and then they are publicly recited. An example of this is the use of one of her lesser known poems that I discuss in this paper at the end, which we may not get to today, but you can read about in the paper itself, which actually I believe is also one of the papers that is available online for free. So one of these examples is this poem, Ey be sar zulf to sodای من, which is often modified and sung as an ode to the first Imam of Shia Islam in honor of the anniversary of his birth. So it's changed to be an ode in honor of Imam Ali. Whereas in Tahirih's poem, it's very clearly an ode to the Bab. In this rendition, no mention is made of the author of the poem, and where the poet refers directly to the Bab by using his title, the most exalted one, Hazrat A'la, it has been modified to be the master, Hazrat Mawla, in order to be a more suitable reference to Imam Ali. However, regardless of how hard men have tried for decades, really, to deny Tahirih's historical and literary presence, they have been unsuccessful. The problems of uncertainty in regards to what poetry was originally composed by her and what is attributed to her have failed, really, to cast her out of her rightful place in the canon of Persian literary figures of the 19th century. And this is really in great part thanks to the painstaking efforts of those in the past, such as E.G. Brown, Asadullah Fazil Mazandarani, and Ni'matullah Zukai Bayzai, as well as more recent scholars, such as Amin Banani, Nusratullah Muhammad Hosseini, Farzaneh Milani, Jonas Hatcher, Amrullah Himmat, and Dominic Parviz Brookshaw, all of whom have made certain that Tahirih's poetic presence is not only not forgotten, but better expounded upon and understood. In addition, when thoroughly analyzed, we see that the poems themselves can potentially act as preservers of the legacy of their author. They present us with a poetic dialogue between Tahirih and both her female and male literary predecessors and contemporaries. And when read against the backdrop of the historical information which we have of her, these poems reflect the different aspects of her life. This should all be mentioned with an important caveat, however, that Tahirih's main presence, not only in history, but almost certainly in her own mind too, was not that of a poet. Her poetic output was a means by which she demonstrated her conviction in what she believed to be the truth and the beginning of a new age in humanity's religious history, the abolition of the Islamic Sharia, the ending of an old cycle of religion, and the ushering in of a new era with new divinely inspired laws brought forth by the Bab. Her poetic works were thus tools through which she could incite the hearts of others to join her in what she believed to be the fulfillment of long-awaited past prophecies and the coming of the Day of Judgment. Amin Banani states that currently only fewer than 60 poems exist which are attributed to Tahirih, and any compilation of these poems cannot be regarded as an authenticated and complete collection of her works, since more texts may surface with the passing of time, the shift of perspectives, and more critical analyses. And this is something that I'm very hopeful for, that God willing, someday more sources will come forth from a variety of sources that are not at hand to us today. However, according to Brookshaw, the poetry that has been attributed to Tahirih up to this point in time can still be analyzed as a means to learn more about how she, as both a woman and as a poet, represented herself or has been represented. An analysis of the poetry attributed to Tahirih and the placing of these poems within the context of the Persian literary canon can also help us understand how her role in the literary history of Iran has been overlooked as a poet who engages with both her literary predecessors and contemporaries, and who, as part of the movement of literary return, Bazgasht Adabi, and a predecessor to modern Persian poetry, She'r Mu'asir, incorporates in her work the style of the former and some of the new innovative subject matters of the latter. As a whole, the poetry attributed to Tahirih can be categorized into two groups: love poems with often heavy mystical undertones, and poems which are a call to action in honor of the arrival of a new spiritual era. In this article, I will discuss 3 poems, 2 of which I will discuss today, attributed to Tahirih, all of which address the dawn of a new day in religious history, even if outwardly they are cloaked in the garments of love. In composing these pieces, Tahirih makes use of 2 poetic devices commonly utilized in Persian poetry, one called istiqbal and the other called tazmin. Istiqbal, which means welcoming literally, is also referred to as jawab, meaning response, and it is a poetic device with which the author composes a poem using the same meter and rhyme of a poem by another poet. Tazmin, which literally means safeguarding, is when a poet quotes a line or a hemistich from another poet in their own work. In the implementation of istiqbal and tazmin, the poet at once both illustrates the width and breadth of their knowledge of poetry and situates themselves within the larger tradition of Persian poets. Through istiqbal, the poet hearkens their predecessors more subtly, whereas in tazmin, the quotation of a renowned poem perhaps places the new poem in a more direct dialogue with the preceding work. In the 3 works that I've analyzed in this article, Tahirih utilizes istiqbal and tazmin in reference to poems by 3 famous poets. The first one, Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi Rumi, known in the West as Rumi, who composed in the 13th century. The second, by Abdul Rahman Nuruddin Jami, a 15th century poet. And the last one, to which we won't get today, but which is the one I was referring to as the one who's often quoted being misattributed to making it for Imam Ali other than the Bab, is an istiqbal of a poem by Muhammad Baqir Sohbat Lari, a 19th century poet. So first we will tend to the poem which is an istiqbal by the poem of Rumi's. As Banani notes, for the reader familiar with this, the following poem immediately harkens a set of ghazals by Rumi, because by using tazmin, Tahirih opens her poem with Rumi's renowned half hemistich. Her poem reads, and I've had the poem up here for you in the translated English, translated by myself humbly and horribly, but I will read the original Persian just so you get a feel for what the poem actually sounds like. Tahirih writes, ای عاشقان شد آشکارا وجه حق رفع حجب گردید هان از قدرت رب الفلق خیزید کین دم با بها ظاهر شده وجه خدا بنگر به صد لطف و صفا آن روی روشن چون شفق. یعنی ز خلاق زمان شد این جهان خرم جنان. روز قیام است ای مهان معدوم شد لیل قسق. آمد زمان راستی کجی شد اندر کاستی. آن شد که آن میخواستی از عدل و قانون و نسق. شد از میان جور و ستم هنگام لطف است و کرم. ایدون به جای هر سقم شد جانشین قوت و رمق. علم حقیقی شد عیان جهل معدوم از میان. برگو به شیخ اندر زمان برخیز و بر هم زن ورق. بود ارچه عمری واژگون وضع جهان از چند و چون. هان شیر آمد جای خون باید بگردانی طبق. گرچه به انظار ملل ظاهر شده شاه دول. لکن به لطف لم یزل برهاند از ایشان قلق. The ghazal is composed in the meter of Rajaz Musamman Salim. A ghazal is a love lyric, a love poetry. So it's composed in the meter of Rajaz Musamman Salim, which is the same meter as 7 of Rumi's poems in his Kulliyat Shams Tabrizi that also begin with the half hemestic, Ey Ashiqan, O lovers, O lovers. Banani states that in this poem, Tahirih is making use of tazmin to begin her poem with the same words that are found in the first line of one of Rumi's well-known poems. But while the opening words and the form of the poem echo the style of Rumi, the rhyme is distinctly different. As a matter of fact, Tahirih's rendition does not share the same rhyme as any of Rumi's sets of poems that begin with the opening, O lovers, O lovers. The poem to which Banani is most likely referring is Rumi's renowned ghazal beginning with Ey Ashiqan, hangam kooch ast az jahan. O lovers, it is time to abandon the world. While this may be true, based on a more predominantly shared themes and a similarity in length, I think that Tahirih's poem may actually be referencing the following ghazal by Rumi. And again, this is my translation of Rumi's poem. ای عاشقان آمد گه وصل و لقا. از آسمان آمد ندا کی ماه رویان صلا. ای سرخوشان آمد طرب دامن کشان. بگرفته ما زنجیر او بگرفته او دامان ما. آمد شراب آتشین ای دیو غم کنجی نشین. ای جان مرگندیش رو ای ساقی باقی درآ. ای 7 گردون مست تو ما مهره ای در دست تو. ای هست ما از هست تو در 100,000 مرحبا. ای مطرب شیرین نفس هر لحظه می جنبان جرس. ای عیش زین نه بر فرس بر جان ما زن ای صبا. ای بانگنای خوش ثمر در بانگ تو طعم شکر. آید مرا شام و سحر از بانگ تو بوی وفا. بار دگر آغاز کن آن پرده ها را ساز کن. بر جمله خوبان ناز کن ای آفتاب خوش لقا. خاموش کن پرده مدر سغراق خاموشان بخر. ستار شو خو گیر از حلم خدا. Both poems, Tahirih's and Rumi's, are exactly 8 lines long, and they share the same theme. They are about the divine beloved. While Rumi's vocabulary and choice of imagery are more enigmatic and playful, leaving room for further interpretations as to whether or not the beloved is human or divine, his use of terms in the opening, such as the time of union and encounter, Gahe Vaslo Liqa, clearly set a mystical tone for the reader familiar with this. On the other hand, through her direct and unenigmatic imagery and language, Tahirih demonstrates from the very beginning that her poem is about a divine beloved and the beginning of a new, long-awaited time. While both poems begin with an announcement regarding the arrival of a new day, the day of reunion with the beloved, or the manifestation of his countenance, their ensuing approach to the topic is quite different. From the opening line of his ghazal onwards, Rumi continues with a variety of panegyric invocations of the beloved and turns the poem into a celebration of the beloved, admonition of those forces contrary to joy and happiness brought by him, and a couple of lines of advice either to himself or his audience, or both, which are inspired by the beloved. Tahirih's rendition, on the other hand, turns into a call to action, very fitting for Tahirih. Throughout the entire poem, verbs in the imperative tense are utilized as a mean to guide the listener, who is presumably a seeker, to act as she demands her audience to arise, barkhiz, to gaze, bengar, to instruct, bargu, and to turn, begardan. To the reader familiar with the historical Tahirih, these calls to action are easily reminiscent of what we know of her. A woman who, in a time of great social restrictions on female movement, made her way from Qazvin to Karbala, to Baghdad, to Kermanshah and Hamadan, and then to Badasht and the north of Iran, as well as to the capital city of Tehran, all the while engaging in debates with prominent clergymen, speaking before groups and teaching them the tenets of her newfound faith, and challenging the authority of the clergy. The emphasis in this poem on concrete action versus beautiful words reminds one of the anecdote which Abdul Baha relays in Tazkiratul Wafa, Memorials of the Faithful, when giving his account of Tahirih. He recalls that one day, while Tahirih was a guest of Baha'u'llah's in his home in Tehran, Sayyid Yahya Darabi, entitled Wahid Akbar by the Bab, came to the house and spoke eloquently about the importance of the Bab's cause, while producing verses and hadiths to demonstrate its validity. Suddenly, in the middle of his words, and while seated behind the customary curtain, Tahirih proclaims, "O Yahya, bring forth deeds if you are a possessor of true knowledge. Now is not the time for recounting traditions. It is the time for visible proofs, the time for steadfastness, the time for tearing the veils of superstition. It is the time to raise the word of God, the time for martyrdom in the path of God. Deeds are needed, deeds." In addition to a tangible sense of urgency and a very clear call to action, Tahirih seems to implement other images in this poem as well, which certainly reference her beliefs and possibly even her life story. The poem opens with the image of the face of truth being unveiled, and this is again repeated in hymnistics 3 and 4 of the Ghazal. This act of unveiling and the reference to the unveiled face of the truth, Wajh Haq, and the face of God, Wajh Khuda, are undoubtedly primarily allusions to her belief in the appearance of the Bab as the promised one, especially since in Shia tradition, the 14 infallibles are believed to be visible proofs of the face of God. Banani also notes that these verses signal the end of the era of expectations and the advent of the promised one, the arrival of the beloved. Although the date of the Ghazal's composition is unknown, and therefore it is impossible to ascertain if Tahirih wrote this poem before or after the conference of Badasht, the constant allusions to the unveiling of a face in the beginning of the poem also remind the reader of that momentous gathering in the summer of 1848. At this event, Tahirih is famed to have entered the gathering of all men without her face veil, an act which caused great uproar both within and without the Babi community. doing this as an active symbol of the breaking of the Bahá'í movement with Islamic tradition and the implementation of a new Sharia. The reference to the world becoming a verdant paradise in the wake of such evocative imagery of the removal of the veil can also be seen to further add to the allusions to the incident in the Garden of Badasht. Interestingly enough, Tahirih then adds in the fourth line, a command coupled with advice. Behold, with much pleasure and delight, that face that is bright like the morn. Read in the context of her unveiling, it can be understood as a paradigm on how her revolutionary act in this garden should be regarded. She is also clearly playing with the imagery of the gaze and the unveiling, which is a common trope in mystical poetry, and further intensifies the lover's longing for and attraction towards his or her beloved. Finally, her reference to the day of resurrection in the second hemistich of the third line, immediately after the mention of the world turning into a verdant paradise, is again reminiscent of her Bahá'í beliefs, and perhaps particularly the events at Badasht, which emphasized that the day in which they lived was the day of judgment itself, and that the first 18 disciples of the Bab, the letters of the living, who had come to believe in him independently, were reincarnations of key Shi'i figures, and that Tahirih herself specifically was the return of Fatimah, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. In addition to references to Bahá'í history, which may be gleaned from the earlier lines of the poem, the later lines may be perceived as referring more to Bahá'í ideology, specifically to concepts such as kindness, grace, and gentleness. We see these when Tahirih proclaims, tyranny and oppression are destroyed. Allow me really quickly to go back on the page to the poem so that you can follow along in case. It's easier that way. Tyranny and oppression are destroyed. It is the time of kindness and grace. Now strength and vigor have replaced all ailments. And again, in the penultimate line, where she converts the image of spilt blood, which is associated here with tribulation and war, to that of flowing milk, which has both biblical and Quranic undertones and represents abundance and peace. Tahirih's emphasis on love and grace recalls the Bab's declaration in the 5th chapter of the 4th Vahid of the Persian Bayan, where he states, and all this have been commanded in the Bayan, that no person should sadden another, so that the Lord of commandment and all creation may not be saddened. The ideas of kindness and munificence are then even further elevated to present divine attributes when Tahirih declares, though the King of the world has appeared to admonish the nations, he shall liberate them from their fetters through eternal kindness. Here again, Tahirih's words echo those of the Babs in the Persian Bayan, where he states, the path to guidance is one of love and compassion, not of force and coercion. This had been God's method in the past and shall continue to be in the future. In Tahirih's closing of the poem, we are presented with two elements, one practical and the other theoretical. Tahirih's final line tells us that although God has returned to admonish the nations, presumably from deviating from the truth, this admonishment will not be carried out by means of punishment or violence, but through kindness. From a practical perspective, this is Tahirih's embracement of kindness as the most effective method of dealing with another, even one's enemy, as this is how God reacts. From a theoretical perspective, and again in line with the Bab's own teachings as manifested in the Persian Bayan, Tahirih is introducing a shift in the traditional notions of a vengeful God, with reprimand and retribution as godly attributes. And instead, she is emphasizing the importance of and even perhaps the sacredness of kindness as the method which the Bab even refers to as God's method in the past and in the present. As a result, we see another break between the tradition of the past and the Bahá'í religion, which continued to establish its independence from its predecessor religions. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop here. I'm out of time. But as I said before, you can find the article online for free on the website, and I can share the website with Robert, so you can share it with all the listeners, so you can read about the other two poems too. But as I stated, I think it's important to really conduct studies of the poetry of Tahirih, or even poetry attributed to Tahirih, because within them we can find elements that truly, A, make us know Tahirih better, and B, really place Tahirih within the historical and poetic time frame of her own era. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahba. That was fascinating. And it is really interesting to see how she utilizes the imagery from Rumi in her poem, and then completely utilizes these ideas and changes them in the new context of the Bahá'í faith.
Yes,
thank you very much. And I will now take you off and add Negar Mottahedeh to our presentation screen here, and I even add her presentation here. Our second speaker is Negar Mottahedeh, who received her PhD in 1999 from the University of Minnesota, and she currently teaches at Duke University. She's a cultural critic and a film theorist who has written about post-revolutionary Iranian cinema, fascinating cinema, I must say, the little bit of it that I've seen, and about gender in Iran. She's also published about Abdu'l-Bahá's travels in Europe and the United States, and her paper today that she's presenting is entitled Not Feminism, Human Solidarity, Qurrat al-Ain Tahirih in Early Historical Drama. So thank you so much for joining us, Negar. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for bringing us all together. And also, thank you so much to Sahba for setting up this, setting things up for my presentation today, and to Sasha and especially Omid Maqami, who shepherded me through the writing of this piece for the special issue on Tahirih in Hawwa. Qurrat al-Ain Tahirih has long been associated with feminism and early agitations for women's rights in Iran and elsewhere. These articulations fly in the face of repeated constructions in the historical work of her contemporaries as the condition of the new, in which everything must change. Indeed, as Todd Lawson has underscored, it has never been established that Tahirih was a champion for women's rights. What we know is that she was a deeply religious mystic who felt a new day arising, arising in the world. She was, he writes, a messianic player. Lawson captures Qurrat al-Ain, the Bahá'í, beautifully, framing her appearance in the writings of her contemporaries as a dramatic figure. She walked, it seems, right out of poems, songs, and higher forms of religio-cultural literature as the return of Fatimeh. And as such, he comments, it was a sacred performance. The attribution of feminism to Qurrat al-Ain is due, in part at least, to Orientalist correlations between female veiling and the oppression of Muslim women. By this logic, the yoking of the title remover of the veil with the figure of a contrarian has associated Qurrat al-Ain with the emancipation of women, and so too with the reclamation of women's liberties and hence women's rights. While her fiery insistence on the abrogation of long-established religious laws and traditions may indeed lead to the leveling of certain inequalities, and in particular, the establishment of equality between women and men, the conflation of the term feminism with Qurrat al-Ain's activities misrecognizes her significance to history. The fusion of the terms relies in part on a basic misunderstanding of the role of the hijab or the veil in Islamic history and the corollary gesture of unveiling attributed to Qurrat al-Ain in Badasht in 1848. In brief, the evocation of the hijab in the early history of Islam suggests differences that suggests the assertion of hierarchical differences and the urgent move to preserve a nascent community in crisis in Medina in 627 AD. The practice of veiling in Islam, like Qurrat al-Ain's unveiling, is said to have emerged from a sacred performance. The compiler of the Hadith, Muhammad al-Bukhari, transmits a recollection that conveys the following. On the night when he celebrated his marriage to Zainab, the Prophet Muhammad became frustrated with his guests. The whole city of Medina had been invited to the celebration, and despite the show of impatience on the part of the Prophet, the guests would not leave. Finally, standing on the threshold of the wedding chamber, he recited the verse of the hijab while drawing a curtain between himself and his companion Anas. The verse 53 of Surah 33 of the Quran, the verse of the hijab, reads as follows: O ye who believe, enter not the dwelling of the Prophet for a meal without waiting for the proper time, unless permission be granted you. But if you're invited, enter, and when your meal is ended, then disperse. Linger not for conversation. Lo, that would be an annoyance to the Prophet, and he would be shy of asking you to go. But Allah is not shy of the truth. The verse of the hijab is construed as a prohibition that concerns space and is associated with the practice of veiling. In this performative act of drawing the curtain, the Prophet established the space between the sublime and the profane, the space between the Prophet and his disciple, while drawing the space between two men. This act and the verse of the hijab situated above all the identity of two men, Anas and the Prophet, as separate, and established a hierarchical division of power between the two through a performative drawing out of the spatial division. The wedding of Zainab and the Prophet took place during a period of instability in which the Prophet attempted to gain a foothold in Medina. The Muslims were constantly under attack by the surrounding community, and it was obvious that one of the most powerful ways of weakening that community, that unsettled community, was by attacking its women. So in the midst of a civil war, the wives of the Prophet started to veil as a way to protect not only themselves from molestation, but to protect the community from vigilant attacks. I suggest here that the verse of the hijab invoked on the Prophet's wedding night entered into an apparatus of power and knowledge. It did so as a tool pertaining to the nature of communal identity at a restless moment in Islamic history. The female body was subsequently construed as the focal point of this identity, and as such, it was given the task of preserving, indeed, enfolding an emerging communal identity by protecting itself. Religious identity was thus construed on the problematic rupture divided on the body's gendered split between nature and culture, and again, historically hierarchized social divide, a body culturally constituted as not only vulnerable, but also naturally harmful, therefore the veiling. Having entered into the apparatus of power and knowledge, the fluctuation of the verse of the hijab within the contending knowledges that surrounded it and the political discourses that activated it problematized the constitution of, of a unified communal identity, giving credence to the claims that historically associate the Muslim community with hierarchy over equality and repression over solidarity. In the final analysis, it was the female body that came to bear the historical burden of defining the character and identity of a community in crisis and set the course for its evolution. Well over a millennium later, the figure of Qurratul Ain is addressed at precisely these defining characteristics as the emerging Babi community is as an emerging Babi community in published manuscripts that began to circulate between 1905 and 1910. Published by Edward Brown in 1910, Nuqtatul Kaf is deemed to contain one of the earliest records of Babi history and therefore perhaps one of the first accounts of the momentous break with traditions and laws of Islam at the Badash Conference. Written sometime before the death of its author, Mirza Jani, in 1852, and redacted numerous times before its publication by Brown, Nuqtatul Kaf renders Babi history as a resurrection of the tragic battle of Imam Hussein in Karbala. The Orientalist scholar Edward Brown takes note of this stylistic device employed by Nuqtatul Kaf in the following account. In Nuqtatul Kaf, Brown writes, Tehran is compared to the capital of the wicked Muawiyah and his yet more wicked son Yazid, while Mullah Hussein is likened to the martyred Imam Hussein and Sheikh Tabarsi, the site of the bloody battle between the Babis and the Qajar troops, to the immortal plain of Karbala. The literary style of Nuqtatul Kaf on the history of the Babis is characteristics of the dramatic reenactment of the early days of Islam. The text thus casts the Babis as actors, or as I would like to call them, role carriers, in the messianic drama representing the tragedy of Imam Hussein in Karbala. Historically, this stylistic device has been a feature of the Taziyah drama and the Muslim eulogies that disperse various Karbala tragedies during the first month of the Muslim year, the month of Muharram. In casting the believers in the mold of a known past, narratives such as the Nuqtatul Kaf call for a redemptive acts by their participant spectators in their own present, in their own time and in their own present. The temporal configuration produced by its repetition hails its audience to collective action. Given the promise of the ultimate redemption to those who support and rectify the wrongs suffered by the meek Imam Hussein, and also to those who grieve his worldly defeat in the present. The author of Nuqtatul Kaf understands the Babi instance of messianic return and reenactment in terms very similar to contemporary understandings of the Taziyah's dramatic practice and its vision of time and space. Nuqtatul Kaf functions as a witness to a theatrical playing out of previous historical events and constructs from this positioning a theory of the Babi movement's urgency in the present moment. The author writes that Mullah Hussein, like Imam Hussein, knew of his death before he died, that the one who arises after 1,000 years demands of the people to avenge the blood of Hussein, and that in Sheikh Tabarsi the Babis did what they did in Karbala. As such, Babi history is a resurrection of Islam's antiquity in its fullness. This signals the arrival of the much-awaited Day of Judgment, a day which classically marks the ultimate break with everything that came before it. In Nuqtatul Kaf, the authority of the Babis is then the result of three simultaneous events that Lawson neatly coins a fulfillment of the past, a reenactment of the past, and a break with the past. The infamy that Qurratul Ain's actions in Badasht conference enjoy in popular Qajar rhetoric differs slightly with the narrative representation of these events in Nuqtatul Kaf. In Nuqtatul Kaf, the Nuqtatul Kaf mainly refers to Qurratul Ain in two instances. The first is a reference to her genealogy in contemporary culture. That is, her family, her breeding, and her role as the agitator of innovations, inspired presumably by the Bab's own writings. The author of Nuqtatul Kaf writes that she attracted the attention of the Turkish government in Karbala, where she resided both immediately before and immediately after her recognition of the Bab's claims. And this was by asserting that she was the manifestation or the mazhar of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatimah. As such, any unclean thing was rendered pure by being submitted before her gaze. In this way, the author constructs his understanding of the present of Babi activity in light of her claims. Historian Dennis McEwen traces the origins of Qurratul Ain Tahirih's claims to be the incarnation of the Holy Fatima in Nuqtatul Kaf with the following. He says, originally, the followers of Qurratul Ain practiced extremely severe forms of asceticism. They would not eat bread from the bazaar. It was considered unclean inasmuch as anyone who rejected the Bab rejected the Prophet Muhammad, and in doing so rejected God. McEwen proceeds, basing this reading on some of the early exhortations of the Bab found in his writings, that this situation continued until the Bab's Risaleh reached Karbala. In this, it was stated that the glances of Fatimah and the Imams were among the agents whereby impure and forbidden materials could be rendered lawful. The entry of this much circulated and translated text of the Bab into the Karbala community, McEwen claims, thus transformed the discourses of the community and its practice and its praxis. The Babis started commerce with the residents in Karbala once again, but mediated their activity through the purifying gaze of one who was understood to be the return of Fatimah, namely Tahirih. In a later document, the Persian Bayan, the Bab writes that the venerated figures of the Imam, the family of the Prophet, have returned to the life of the world, presumably in the persons of the first to accept him. Lawson again writes, thus Tahirih not only assumed the role of Fatimah, she was Fatimah. Regarding the Badasht conference, Nuqtatul Kaf notes that the rumors of the events that took place at that conference, partly true and partly false, preceded the conference participants wherever they went, causing great clamor and dispute in the towns and villages in which the Babis traveled. One is to wonder then at the gravity of the events that were rumored to have taken place, since in each instance after the conference, Nuqtatul Kaf reports that the Babis were molested and attacked by villagers and by the Shah's armies. According to the historian Abbas Amonat's perusal of the original sources, the Babi conference in Badasht was held for 3 weeks between June and July of 1848. The group's charismatic leader, Sayyid Ali Muhammad, surnamed the Bab, had claimed in 1844 to be the gate or the Qa'im, who would usher forth a new era in religious history. Due to his claim to be the Messiah, which traditionally would imply the imminent relinquishment of power by both the Shia clergy and the Qajar dynasty, the Bab was imprisoned by the authorities in a remote castle prison in Azerbaijan. So the prime agenda of the group of 81 Babis at Badasht was the plight of the Bab. They were anxious to find a way to rescue him. This raised the question of the Bab's precise claims and the nature of his mission. Who was he? Was he the Qa'im, the Messiah? Was his message a rejuvenation of religious truth? Or did he intend to establish a new and independent religion? These pressing questions were meant to establish the status of the movement and the identity of the community. Sources reveal a factional setting in which the nature of the present and the identity of the movement was debated. And while there is evidence to suggest that there were three factions, those who supported Qurratul Ain, those who supported Qudus, and those who were neutral, it's unclear who asked which questions and with what gains. The most obvious outcome of the Badash debates was the prevalence of Qurratul Ain's views. Qurratul Ain Tahirih took on the leading role at the conference, arguing for a definitive break with religious laws. According to the French Orientalist A.L.M. Nicolas sources, it was part of her strategy to offer the assembled a soft introduction to the abrogation of the Sharia laws by dramatizing Qudus's opposition to the heresy of her own claims. She manufactured a duel between herself and Qudus, in other words, to clearly stage the consequences of the choices that had to be made by those assembled Babis at Badasht. The radical split is said to have determined the dynamics of the Badasht conference. The account that is given by Nuqtatul Kaf is somewhat different. Without giving a detailed account of a dispute between the Babi figures, Nuqtatul Kaf records a speech delivered at the Badasht conference. Brown notes that because of the corruption of the manuscript at this point, he cannot say whether this speech was delivered by Qudus or Qurratul Ain. Brown reports on the nature of this speech. The doctrine of the return is treated at some length. The outward forms of religion, that is prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and alms, are all explained allegorically. The abrogation of the laws of previous dispensations is announced, and laws in general are declared to be necessary only till such time as men have learned to comprehend the doctrine of unity. By which is meant the recognition of the true nature of the divine manifestation of the age. The reintroduction of the doctrine of return in Nuqtatul Kaf's narrative, regardless of who introduced it, concurs with other chronicles that a break with the laws of the Sharia occurred in Badasht. Having constituted the grounds for the legitimate severance of the Sharia, supported by a commentary on the doctrine of the traditions of resurrection, and concluding the report on Badasht, Nuqtatul Kaf claims that the clamor and noise of the conference attracted the people from neighboring villages and areas. It remarks that Qudus had foretold an uprising and that he counseled those gathered to not take up arms. Accordingly, the uninvited visitors attacked the conference participants overnight and took them for everything. A.L.M. Nicolas, the French Orientalist and early translator of the Bab's works, confirms that the effect of Qurratul Ain Tahirih's speech produced on the community was astounding. He writes that the assembled Babis in Badasht acted as if they had been struck by lightning. Some hid their faces with their hands, others prostrated themselves, others covered their heads with their garments so that they could not see the features of Her Highness, the Pure One. A few looked, as she tried to convince them by walking among them, that they were that they were her brothers, telling them that the Quran had been abrogated and that the laws that ordered women to veil no longer existed. Confirming Nuqtat al-Kaf's reference to the noise and clamor of the conference, Nicolas describes the tumult of the lightning scene and notes that the discussion among the members of the community rose to a level of violence, recognizing that things could take a turn to the tragic. Baha'u'llah is said to have thrown an outer garment on the poet's head and led her away. But what of the poet's reputed unveiling in Nuqtat al-Kaf? Historians whose work is involved in the process of documentation cannot tell us why the author and redactors of Brown's Nuqtat al-Kaf would ignore Qurrat al-Ain's Tahirih's unveiling. But the comparative cultural and literary analysis, such as the one that I have attempted here, creates a significant frame for the analysis of this question. I've argued that, like many of the sources of early Bahá'í historiography, Nuqtat al-Kaf relies on the tropes of the Ta'ziyah to achieve its historical purpose. Nuqtat al-Kaf uses the Karbala tragedies, familiar dramatic tropes, space and time, to engage emotions and actions of its constituents in the present. Thus, in each instance, the actions and persons of the Bahá'í leaders and the spaces in which they move, like those of the actors on the Ta'ziyah dramatic stage, are uniquely tied to the early Muslim heroes and the Shia visions of their resurrection on the Day of Judgment. Mullah Hussein is Imam Hussein, Sheikh Tabarsi is Karbala, and the Bab, the Messiah, is the Messiah returned. The day, the present, is uniquely connected to both the vision of a reenacted past and the return of that moment on the day made special for its significance as Judgment Day. The Ta'ziyah's drama enacts a resurrection of the present and its fulfillment. Its formal tropes situate the break with the past by embodying the space and time of the future Judgment Day. It is into this all-encompassing crisis, introduced as al-yom, the present, or the day in Nuqtat al-Kaf, that Qurrat al-Ain's activities in Karbala are injected as the first to have removed religious limitations. Established as the return of Fatimah before her arrival in Badasht, Qurrat al-Ain's gaze is rendered in Nuqtat al-Kaf as the purifying gaze of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. Her gaze, as Fatimah's gaze, is introduced to the reader in the scene chronologically prior. In literary terms, then, her body is given the task of maintaining the identity of the emergent community of Babis in Badasht and of protecting the new community in this moment of crisis, even before her arrival in Badasht. As the embodiment of Fatimah's purifying gaze, Qurrat al-Ain makes all that was unlawful lawful. As in Karbala, her gaze levels the hierarchical structures that divide the space between the self from the space of the other, that is, the space of the home from the space of the market, and indeed private space, female space, from public space, male space. While other significant Bahá'í events are represented in Nuqtat al-Kaf as uniquely linked to Messianic time, the moment of the poet's unveiling issues a now time without precedence. Her unveiling, in other words, is severed from both the Shia vision of Judgment Day and the limits established by Muslim law. Not answerable to a dramatic resurrection of an action in the past, the unveiling of Qurrat al-Ain becomes the very embodiment of the community's act of shedding and the condition on which the new emerges. Hers is the body in which the new is made lawful and subject to protection from hierarchical divisions. Nuqtat al-Kaf is a palimpsestic text, at once a historical manuscript, a drama, and a document of national regeneration. For the Persian reader, the circular stage of the Taziyah serves well to illustrate the drama and the chaos of the eschatological presence dramatically within the text. On this open circular stage, encircled by its participant spectators, time and space collide, and identities are donned and shed. In the movement of the role carriers on and around the stage, the past turns into the present, and the Imam returns to Karbala to redeem all past wrongs. To communicate the dramatic impact of the events in Badasht, early Western chroniclers followed a very similar route. They too turned to the theater as a preferred genre. Writing of Badasht in London in 1914, Thomas K. Chain, the biblical critic, notes that the dramatic tropes of the theater seem to give a more vivid idea of the scene than is possible for a mere narrator. On the front-facing stage of the Western theater, however, it is the curtain and not the movement of the role carriers that brings home the unequivocal break represented by Qurratul Ain's actions in time and space. This may indeed explain the dramatic role played by the curtain in Nicolas' description of the Badasht conclave. Nicolas writes that in Badasht Qurratul Ain suspended two cords to a piece of cloth, creating a curtain behind which she spoke. This was customary during her lectures. In preparation, she had dressed herself in her finery, had armed her two maids with a pair of scissors, and at her signal, they cut the cord suspending the curtain, allowing it to fall to the ground. The scene at Badasht is undeniably familiar. It reverses the scene of the curtain fall in at the Prophet's wedding in Medina. This is a point not lost on the conference participants who report the incidents to Qudus, at least in Nicolas' rendition of it. Nicolas writes that Qurratul Ain begins her lecture to a rapt audience. She signals her maids to cut the cords, proclaiming, "You all know today that God has manifested himself and that the Quran is abrogated. A new book has come down from heaven. A new law is given to us." The curtain having fallen, Qurratul Ain appears before the eyes of the dazzled listeners. The report of the community's malcontent with Qurratul Ain is met with deft equanimity by Qudus, who, to soften the blow, had strategically absented himself from the scene of lightning. According to Nicolas, that was a strategy planned by Qudus and Qurratul Ain Tahirih, who together had decided to give the community the opportunity to acclimate themselves to the shattering announcement of the new day and the abrogation of the old, and to consciously choose their destinies accordingly. Claiming confusion at Qurratul Ain's statements regarding the abrogation of the Quran, Qudus is said to have retorted to the complaints that the Mahdi or Messiah arrives to amplify the message of the Quran and not to destroy it. Further, such statements only prove Qurratul Ain's impiety and heresy, according to Qudus. But perhaps he is said to have mused. Perhaps there is a hidden meaning to all this, a mysterious significance to these effects. The idea of a hidden meaning or mysterious significance planted by Qudus after the fall of the curtain becomes the seed for much discussion and that ensued amongst the community gathered at Badasht. Nicolas claims that Qurratul Ain was in turn informed of her excommunication by Qudus. She assembled those who have remained faithful to her, and in a dramatic life and death duel that drew Qudus back into her presence, continuing their pre-designed plan. She explained the new doctrine and the divinity of the Bab to Qudus, and having victoriously demonstrated by way of quotations from the Quran and the Hadith the task of the hidden Imam and the greatness of the role played by the Bab, Qudus is said to have embraced the truth of her claims and asked her forgiveness ask her forgiveness for his errors and blasphemies. All of Qudus's peoples, writes Nicolas, imitated him, and a new religious era was founded in the midst of universal enthusiasm and joy. The American artist Laura Dreyfus Barney's rendition of the life of Qurratul Ain in God's Heroes, written in Paris less than 4 years after the publication of Nicolas's book, reiterates aspects of Nicolas's marvelous theatricality and adds to the fall of the curtain in Nicolas's lightning scene a vital return to the recitation of the verses of the Quran. In Barney's dramatic vision of the Badasht conclave, Tahirih emerges from her tent with her face unveiled and moves towards Baha'u'llah's tent. He's been feeling unwell and calls her to a meeting. On the set, which Barney paints with the descriptors meadows, trees, and tent, Qurratul Ain emerges from her tent to announce to a group of deliberating Babis returning from their midday siesta that she indeed is the sound of the trumpet. She is the sound that is to usher in the day of judgment. As such, all barriers of the past must fall. Hurriedly, Tahirih's Babi compatriots rush to complain of her blasphemy to Baha'u'llah. His answer is a call to read the surah describing the day of judgment. The curtain falls as Ali, one of Barney's conference participants, reads the surah of the event from the Quran. Chaos reigns. Meanwhile, as some of the assembled Babis run away and others kill themselves, and others still appear triumphantly happy. In Barney's theatrical rendition of the Badasht conference, the curtain refines the force of the poet's claims, signaling Tahirih as the condition of the new, whereby all things must undergo change. In spatial terms, the curtain falls to mark the end of one moment and announce the arrival of the next. Beyond feminism, then, Qurratul Ain's role, in the published words of her contemporaries, is an unequivocal charge to overthrow tradition and to serve as the condition of the new. She is the embodiment of this emergence. Key here is Qurratul Ain Tahirih's status as Fatimeh, whose body protects the emergent Babi community, even as she announces her solidarity with the men as her brothers and the leveling of differences within and outside of the community. Beyond the urgency of women's rights and liberties, it is the new that, according to her contemporaries, is shepherded before her purifying gaze. It is the new Aeon that answered her thunderous roar at the conclave of Badasht in 1848. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Negar. That is fascinating, and it's quite exciting to hear the Nuqtat al-Qaf variant, which many Baha'is are not familiar with. And so we really are grateful for that. I should remind everybody that if they have questions, they can post them in the chat, and we will get to them after our third presentation. And we will turn to the third presentation now. I will move Negar in here and put in Sasha and his presentation as well. Our third speaker is Sasha Dehghani. He received his MA degree in Islamic Studies, Political Science from Protestant Theology and Religious Studies in Political Science, Protestant Theology and Religious Studies from Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, and earned a summa cum laude PhD in Arabic Studies from the Free University of Berlin. Dr. Dehghani has taught and conducted research at leading academic institutions in Germany, the Middle East, and the United States, such as the American University of Beirut, the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research in Berlin, or the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. Since 2012, Dr. Dehghani has been a researcher and project manager at the Center for the Study of the Sacred Texts at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa. His most recent appointments include the Forum Humanum visiting professorship at the Academy of World Religions at the University of Hamburg in 2020-21, and service as visiting research professor at the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. His paper, which we will now hear, is entitled Tahirih Qurrat al-Ain and the Women's Avant-Garde in Europe. So thank you so much for joining us, Sasha, and we welcome you to this forum, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, dear Robert. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak here today. Good evening from Germany. I think in the States is not a later evening, but in Germany that's the case. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing two different sessions with each 3 different papers and presentations so that we can share the findings of our research and what we have published in the journal. Of course, also I would like to thank my dear colleague and friend, Professor Omid Maqami, who encouraged me to be a co-editor of this wonderful volume. So today I'm the last and of course certainly also the least of the speakers, and with my presentation, and I will jump right into it given that we have something about half an hour. For the sake of simplicity, I have entitled the presentation today as Tahirih in Europe. Of course, Tahirih died, as we know, in mid-19th century, and she herself physically was never in Europe. But today, I'm talking about her afterlife, or the legacy that is her impact on the continent of Europe. Tahirih Qurrat al-Ain has been described as the first woman in Iran to publicly advocate for the rights of women, and even as the first feminist of her country. Though her influence in Persia was significant, at least within the Babi and the Baha'i religious communities, her legacy found an astounding recognition in Europe, where she became a symbol of women's emancipation and intellectual courage. My presentation today examines, and part of as a result of the article published, Tahirih's reception across 5 European countries, that is Austria, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain, highlighting different ways in which her life and message inspired early feminists, writers, artists, and intellectuals in the Western Hemisphere. In the following, I will briefly mention and bring some examples of these 5 countries showing Tahirih's influence on Europe, especially on women in Europe. However, I won't be able to go into a great detail, and so please bear with me if the amount of information related to a specific person or related to historical dates, places, and sources will be rather rudimentary or limited. Of course, more information is provided in the article, and the audience is most welcome to refer to the journal, not only to my article, but to the other articles in this journal. So we start with these 5 different cases. We will start with Austria. In Austria, the Hungarian-Austrian poet Marie von Niemeyer immortalized Tahirih's story in a lengthy epic poem, 200 pages almost, 6 different songs, published in the early 1870s in Austria. The book was entitled as Qurrat al-Ain and was widely studied. Niemeyer became friends with another Austrian lady, a founding figure of the women's movement in Austria, Marianne Heinisch. The quote that you can see here, the following quote, is taken from a report written by Martha Root, a journalist who became Baha'i around the time of the First World War. She traveled through many countries in the world to spread the teachings of the Baha'i faith. And Ruth writes, this is the quote that you can see here, "When I was in Vienna, Austria a few years ago, I had an interview with the mother of the president of Austria, Mrs. Marianne Heinisch, the woman who has done most for women's education in Austria, that nation of great culture. Miss Heinisch established the first high school for girls in her land. She told me that the inspiration of all her life work had been Tahirih of Iran. Miss Heinisch said, I was a young girl, only 17 years old, when I heard of the martyrdom of Tahirih, and I said, I shall try to do for the girls of Austria what Tahirih tried to do and gave her life to do for the girls of Iran. And she told me I was married and my husband too was only 17. Everybody was against education for girls, but my young husband said, if you wish to work for the education of girls, you can. And this clearly shows in two different cases, Maria von Nijmeijer and her book, but also the work of Marianne Heinisch, how important Tahirih was as a role model to the women's movement in Austria. Because of time, I will quickly go through these examples. The next case that I've chosen is France. Here on the left top side, you can see the famous Sarah Bernard. So in France, interest from cultural icons and what we nowadays would call superstars like Sarah Bernard reflected a fascination with Tahirih's dramatic life. Bernard wanted to embody Tahirih on stage and asked her friend Catulle Mendes, a poet and dramatist, to write a theater play on the life of Tahirih for her. But as far as we can tell, this play was never completed. In 1906, Mendes wrote in Le Figaro, a famous French newspaper, and this is a translation with the help of a friend, Wendy Heller, we translated this from French into English. I read the quote for you. Mendes wrote, it was around 1868, so old am I, that after having read Les religions et les philosophies dans l'Asie centrale by Comte de Gomidon, I first had the thought of bringing to the stage the noble and lovely Illuminée who, having for her real name Zarin Taj, that is crown of gold, and surnamed Qurratul Ain, that is consolation of the eyes, is still venerated by millions of the faithful under the name of Hazrat Tahirih, that is Her Highness the Pure. I have very often spoken of the intended work. 7 or 8 years ago, I had recounted to Jules Claretie the fifth act, the only one then fixed in my mind. If one rereads the interviews on the occasion of the debut of Medea, I believe in 1898, one will find there the title and the still incomplete outline of the drama already begun. Will I finish it, this drama which has haunted me for so long? I don't know. Yes, perhaps this summer, but there's nothing of which Miss Marilyn Markovich needs to worry about. Everyone has the right to worship and celebrate the divine consolation of the eyes, also called Her Highness the Pure. So this is quite a fascinating text that I found in Le Figaro. The background to this is that the aforementioned Madame Markovich, a French journalist and feminist, had expressed her worries also in Le Figaro prior to the Mendes article. She informs the readers that she's working since some time on the script and playwright on the life of Tahirih, but she has also been informed, it has come to her ears, that Mendes is at the same time in parallel working on a script on the very same theme. So it seems that some form of competition was in the air, but to this Mendes responds and actually consoles Markovich, and she says that everyone in this world has the right to celebrate the life of Tahirih. I will move on to jump now to the case of Germany. In Germany, the Orientalist and professor of Iranian studies, Friedrich Karl Andreas, documented Tahirih's life with great admiration, introducing her to literary and intellectual German circles, which included figures like his own famous wife, Lou Andreas Salome. Here you can see the cover of his book, Die Babis in Persien, Babis in Persia, Ihre Geschichte und Lehre, which was published 1896 in Germany. 3 years later, after this publication, Andreas, together with his wife Lou Salome and their friend Rainer Maria Rilke, traveled to Russia and met Leo Tolstoy in Russia. Tolstoy asked Andreas, after this meeting, once he has returned to Germany, to send him his publication, Die Babis in Persien. And Andreas did so. Lou Salome wrote later on that Tolstoy's main interest was to interview her husband about the Bahá'í religion. She was kind of disappointed that Tolstoy didn't show too much interest in her presence or in Rilke's work. One has to know now that Lou Salome in Germany was very well known, was close to Nietzsche, a friend of Klee. She knew Sigmund Freud very well, and she really, in a way, was used to get a lot of attention from German intellectuals. But in Russia, a place she originally came from, she was not really at center stage when she met Tolstoy. So what can we read about Tahirih? What do we know about Tahirih in Germany in that time period? This is what Andreas wrote about her. The female apostle, one of the most remarkable and captivating appearances in this movement is Zarin Taj, the Golden Crown, better known as Qurratul Ain, Joy of the Eyes. She came from Qazvin, from a family of clerics. However great her beauty was said to have been, it seems to have been yet surpassed by her spirit and character. Early on, she participated in scholarly conversations of her relatives and soon stood out due to the astounding keenness of her mind and the richness of her spirit. She absorbed his, that is the Bab's, ideas with such fervent enthusiasm that she was stirred to appear publicly, cast off the veil which covers every woman in public there, and proclaim the teaching of her master. To no avail were the efforts of her relatives to lead her back to the path of tradition and upset her plans. She countered everything with unswerving resistance. Once Qurratul Ain had openly professed her faith, and at her interrogation her death sentence was announced. Her execution was performed by the war minister and his adjutant, a European, Dr. Pollack, attested as an eyewitness to the virtually superhuman fortitude which she had shown forth at the moment of her death. So we move from Germany to Russia. Here you can see a very nice photograph of Isabel Grinevskaya on the left side. In Russia, Isabel Grinevskaya, of Jewish background, a novelist, poet, polyglot, writer, penned a play, The Bab, in 1903. This play brought Tahirih to the Russian theater and stages of St. Petersburg, the birthplace, quite interesting, of the aforementioned Lou Salome. A lady by the name Musil Borozdina was the actress who played Tahirih. In this play, Tahirih appears as a somewhat, I would like to say, romanticized figure, but still a powerful voice for women's liberation. At one point in this play, Tahirih addresses the women of Iran collectively, and she asks them to and encourages them to remove their chadors and to wipe away their pain and blood with their chadors. The play was well received, even gaining praise by Leo Tolstoy. And some years later, Grinevskaya visited, being accompanied by Ali Akbar Nakhjavani, Abdul Baha in Egypt, and she actually accepted the faith. And a few years later, I think she also penned another play on the life and mission of Baha'u'llah. So we move on to England, Great Britain. In England, Tahirih became famous first through Orientalist sources such as the just mentioned A.G. Brown, later on through British suffragette movement such as Charlotte Despard, but also the Pankhurst sisters and other representatives of this movement, with Despard calling her, that is Tahirih's life, a priceless gift to the worldwide struggle for women's rights. Here we have a quote by Charlotte Despard, which she wrote in 1911. I tried to shorten the quote, so the full quote is cited in my article, but the last part is here. All these events bear evidence to the fact that through Qurratul Ain's own country, her message of liberty has spread. But it is not to Persia alone, it is to the whole world of men and women everywhere that the gift of this priceless life has been made. It is because she and such as she have lived and loved, suffered and died, that womanhood has arisen from its lowest state. It is because the power of their life is behind us that nothing can make us fall back in despair. As we know, we have a different article in our journal written by our dear friend and colleague Amin Ikhea. Abdul Baha also visited England at the eve of the First World War, and he met leading figures of the suffragette movement. And it is very clear that he was the one to present Tahirih to this movement as a role model for women emancipation. But I might speak briefly about this a bit later. So trying to summarize what I have just presented, maybe in the last 10-15 minutes, we can say here's that we can see a map of Europe. Marie von Nijmeijer in Austria, on the right side, below on the left side, Sarah Bernard, center place, Andreas and his wife Lou Salome, Grinevskaya in this region from Russia, and then Charlotte Despard in England. So from the years 1870 up to the First World War, one can truly say that Tahirih step by step conquered Europe. And this reminded me of a statement that Abdul Baha made when he was in Paris. One can read this statement in Paris Talks, where he says that the West has always received enlightenment from the East. The song of the kingdom is first heard in the East, but in the West, the greater volume of sound burst upon the listening ears. And I think in a way one could say really that Europe was listening to the words of and mission of Tahirih. On the top left corner, I've added a photograph of the book written by Martha Root. In the 1930s, she wrote a book on Tahirih, the Pure One, and for many decades it was the leading biography on the life of Tahirih. Now, having said that, despite this early enthusiastic afterlife of Tahirih in Europe and the West, after the Second World War, Tahirih's name and fame fades gradually from Europe's consciousness at large. Maybe with a few exceptions, like Annemarie Schimmel's work that could be mentioned here, a famous German Orientalist. She continued to rescue Tahirih from amnesia, but there's not that much that I was able to find in the 50s and 60s and 70s, not in the same way as, she existed before the period of the Second World War. However, in contrast, countless publication, documentaries, movies have appeared about step by step about some of the European women mentioned in this article. The New York Review of Books, for example, referred to Sarah Bernard at the beginning of the 21st century as the, quote, the most famous actress the world has ever known. Books about her, films, dance workshops, documentaries, exhibitions, merchandise, they keep on coming, unquote. And in a recent Hollywood production about the suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst was portrayed by Meryl Streep, who, refusing to see herself as a feminist, nevertheless, she said that in an interview, believes that the suffragette movement taught us many important lessons. Again, quote, not to give up in the face of patronizing ridicule, amused disdain, or being ignored. And she characterizes the personality of the suffragette as, again, quote, courageous, relentless, righteous, and also right, unquote. All these characteristics, however, also, of course, manifest in Tahirih. Yet with regard to the figure that these women looked to as their own heroine, there's some form of silence. I did my best to explain this decline of interest and silence after the Second World War. Luckily, Elnaz Nasehi, a professor in Iranian studies in Cyprus, also read my article that was published in this journal, and she summarized the last part of my article and the findings actually in a better way than I was able to do it myself. So I chose a short passage from her article that she wrote. She says that Tahirih's name appears to have vanished from Europe's collective memory following World War II. And referring to my article, then she continues, Dehghani identifies 3 factors contributing to this disappearance. Firstly, feminism has often been associated with a Western concept of liberated womanhood, resulting in what is known as hegemonic feminism. Secondly, confining Tahirih's relevance solely to one religious community or academic discipline denies her broader universal impact and lasting legacy. And thirdly, or lastly, Tahirih did not openly address feminism or women's suffrage or women's rights in her works. So thank you once again to Professor Nasehi summarizing it this way. I had not mentioned 1, 2, or 3, but trying to come up with some reasoning, she actually correctly came up with 3 different points at the end of my article. Now, having said that, just briefly to mention, of course, number 1, feminism as a Western concept is the idea that although women's studies and studies in the field of feminism, are very progressive, there's a tendency, or for some time at least, there might have been a tendency to believe that something like the liberation of women can only be a product of the Western world. So there is some exclusivism which has been called in this very field by authors themselves as a hegemonic feminism. The second part, confining Tahirih's relevance solely to one religious community or academic discipline, just to explain briefly. Of course, after the Second World War, we have important publications written by Bahá'í authors, be it scholarly or maybe in form of fiction, like the beautiful work by Bahá'í and Nakhjavani. Even our academic work in this journal itself is academic and in the same time, written by Baha'is. We have also some interest in Tahirih in the field of Iranian studies and Middle Eastern studies, or the Iranian diaspora. But there's a difference to the period that I see before the Second World War, the 5 cases that I summarize, where Tahirih is really part of the collective consciousness in Europe, and one I would have expected after the Second World War, step by step, that Tahirih would be part of school educational curricula systems and many other, educational books teaching young people about her life. But I haven't seen that reality in Europe. It might come. I'm not sure. It might not come. About the last point, and coming to the end of my presentation, Tahirih did not openly address feminism or women's suffrage. That is right. Also, to some extent, we just heard some aspects of this in the presentation of dear Negar. However, referring to the late Amin Banani, cited several times in both sessions, I realized a very important, outstanding professor in the field of Iranian studies at UCLA, I thought it would be interesting to close my presentation with something that he wrote about Tahirih and the question of women's emancipation. Banani states a statement attributed to Tahirih at the hour of her death. "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women," was probably never uttered, just as Louis XIV probably never said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. But they both should have done so, for every act of their lives was a testament to the truth of those statements. Tahirih's indomitable will, her forthright claim to equal power based on learning, her uncompromising defense of her beliefs in the face of opposing men, her implacable refusal to bow to domestic pressure, her painful choice to abandon home, husband, and children rather than submit to injustice, and above all, the dramatic gesture of public unveiling are more eloquent than 1,000 tracts on the rights of women. In the context of 19th century Persian Shiite society, or indeed even this late in the 20th century, what more could a woman do that would mark her a greater champion of women's rights? Now, our journal was unfortunately published a few years after the passing of Professor Banani, but be it as it may, the article mentioned before by Amin Echea points out that these last words attributed to Tahirih, that the source for these words are the utterances of Abdul Baha himself, made during his stay in England. And it was also Abdul Baha who, when he met the suffragette, interpreted the Badasht Conference as the resurrection of the dead cause of women. So to conclude, I think one could say Tahirih's appearance at Badasht was certainly, as Negar pointed out, based on dear Professor Lawson's reading, part of a sacred performance, a part of religious world and even apocalyptic in nature. But then maybe there's no contradiction to another aspect also coming directly from Abdul Baha, and I think Shoukh Effendi builds on that and God Passes By later on. That is that Tahirih certainly contributed to the question of women's emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sasha. That was fascinating, and it's really quite exciting to see how many people were moved by her story in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe. And it does show indeed that she has been this sort of icon for something, women's rights, women's development for really quite a long time. In fact, I once saw a play in English that was put on by some Iranian Americans who weren't Baha'is about Tahirih, where she was portrayed as a kind of liberator. And so it shows you how much she has become something far bigger than just a Babi or Baha'i figure, but really a figure that has acquired an importance to the Iranian people in general, if not to the whole world. So let me put our colleagues back in here, and we can see what further discussion we might want to have. I don't see any questions at the moment, and if anyone has questions, they can pose them in the chat box. If you are watching this on YouTube, you will be able to pose the questions there, and they should feed into the list in front of me. And so I guess I'll start by asking everyone among the panelists if you have any additional comments about each other's presentations or insights that you acquired as a result of them.
I had a question for Sasha. I wanted to go back to, thank you for your lovely presentation. And I wanted to go back to Lou Salome and Leo Tolstoy. She used to be, for me, she was such an incredible figure as a teenager, reading, Nietzsche and Freud and all those guys that, informed my early, like, theoretical evolution. And I was curious whether Tolstoy had watched the Russian play on Tahirih before he met Lou, or if it was afterwards.
Yeah, I think it was afterwards, because Andreas wrote 1896. He published this book on the Babis in Persia. They traveled 1899, and I think the year later to Tolstoy, met him and did other things in Russia. And Grinevskaya wrote her script in 1903. It came to theaters in the years following, and Tolstoy wrote very positive kind of critique about the play of Grinevskaya. He was very critical. When you read his letters addressed to colleagues, internal letters, it's sometimes close to what we could say backbiting, but having said that, of course, as a critique, he is a well-known figure, and he was very open, I think, to the play. Yeah, but it's very important that Tolstoy, therefore we can say, learned about the faith at the last part of the 19th century. Quite interesting to German Orientalists. And Andreas, by the way, he was half Persian, from the Bagratuni Armenian family, half German, and he visited Iran and lived there before, I think, E.G. Brown's books were published. Brown was in touch with Andreas. They knew each other, but Andreas had different sources. It's not that he was dependent on other Orientalist works, because he was already a professor in Iranian studies, and he moved from Berlin to Göttingen. And I did some archival research in Cambridge, in England, and Göttingen, and I actually came across a fascinating letter written by Martha Root to Andreas, encouraging him to become kind of an external collaborator of the Bahá'í community and to help to translate the writings.
Mm-hmm.
Because she says in these years when she traveled in Germany and Europe in 1920s and 30s, she rightly pointed out that we have very few experts. There was no dear Sahba with that amount of knowledge in Persian literature. And Andreas was very, very well known in Germany. But his relationship to Lou Salome was also a bit special. They married, but under the condition that she asked him not to have any physical contact with her, and he accepted it. And she was really an outstanding figure. Everyone knew her, and bit of a femme fatale, but yeah, but maybe I should be careful. It's all recorded now.
Well, it was already public information, I assume. Anyway,
Yeah,
I assume that Grinskaya's manuscript still exists.
yeah, it exists. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I haven't seen some full translation. I mean, I'm waiting for some friends with that language skills, to be honest, to do it. I was happy to have a friend with Russian knowledge and who helped me to identify this part on the chadors, which actually in Russian is the same term that is used. She says, remove the chadroi, and chadroi seems to be in Russian the plural of chador, and it is quite interesting etymologically. But to be honest, it's non-existent, my Russian, and to do this type of research, one needs some collaborators, and I hope there will be a full translation with the commentary sometime soon. She's a fascinating figure, and knew many people. She was Jewish background, and very well known among also Jewish intellectuals nowadays. And yeah, she traveled to Egypt she accepted the faith. Quite a journey for a woman in that period, to leave Russia and meet Abdul Baha in Alexandria, I think is where they met. Yeah.
And the manuscript of Laura Barney's play also, I suppose, it still exists. So we have that as well.
That would be to Negar.
Yeah, I mean, I found it out online, so it's there.
Fantastic. I was really struck by Negar by the differences between the Dawnbreakers version of the stories of Badasht and the Nuqtat al-Qaf versions. And I think that's an important thing to highlight for at least the Baha'is in the audience, who, of course, might very well be shocked to hear some of these different variants about a veil being dropped and all this kind of stuff. So I wonder if you could say anything more about that, just for people's knowledge.
Well, I mean, I think that the Dawnbreakers, while it is attributed to Nabil, draws on various sources. And I think that to make it accessible to, it was initially written in, let's say rewritten, not a straightforward translation, but rewritten by Shoghi Effendi for a Western audience. It had to be formulated both temporally and spatially in ways that a Western audience understood it. And so, it's the differences that I was trying to I was playing with in the piece were how does the theatricality of the events that took place in Badasht take shape on a circular stage where there is no curtain, and time and space basically are come to be by the movement of the actors on and around the stage, and the way that the audience relates to it. Versus on a front-facing stage where there is a curtain that goes up and down and cuts off one moment from another. And I really think that in Nabil's narrative, the notion of time and space is very much that of the theatricality of the Western stage. But he also does these things where he introduces figures. For example, the figure of one of the bodyguards of Tahirih is introduced before he is he calls before he recalls what happened at Badasht. So he becomes the recollector of what happened in Badasht and the recollector of Tahirih. He is actually the bodyguard. And so he is introduced chronologically before the Badasht conference is introduced. So there are these plays in time and space that I'm very interested in that happen in all of these texts. And they are crucial in literary terms for historical, for the, let's say, an unconscious understanding of what is happening in the text for a reader. And for me, this temporal understanding in Nabil's narrative is very specifically for a Western audience that understands chronology rather than this playing back and forth between present, past, future, and so forth.
Very interesting. Thanks. Sahba, I was very interested in your comment that we have, 60 or so poems of Tahirih that we're fairly sure about?
That's according to Dr. Banani, yes.
Yeah. Do we know how many of them have some of these literary allusions to previous poems, or are they all independent of the literary tradition? Have you studied them at all and got any sense of how much he's interacting with the rich?
From my research, it was mainly these three that I've talked about that seem to be some sort of istiqbal or tazmeen, but it may be more too. But from what I found, it was these three, but I wouldn't be surprised if more of them do have elements of it. Definitely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And how many additional poems beyond the 60 do we have that are uncertain about Tahirih? Do we have any at all that are kind of, their status are uncertain?
There are, yeah. I mean, even amongst those 60, I think the status of the uncertainty is there. Unfortunately, with the poetry of Tahirih, because we don't have many primary sources of, like, you know, actual manuscripts in her hand or something right. from her time necessarily, it's mostly poetry that is either said to have been recited by her and then therefore thinking that it belonged to her, or poems that later on people have said, oh, she used to, you know, she had written this somewhere, or that she used to recite it. But the actual sources don't exist so much. So yeah, it's Dr. Banani says it's between 60, but I think actually if we Dr. Mohammad Hosseini's book Hazrat Tahirih is a great resource for bringing together the poetry attributed to Tahirih, and I think I would say that it's probably more than 60 in there that are attributed to her.
And how common is this problem with other poems? You mentioned Jami and various others. How common is it to be uncertain about the authorship of Persian poetry, would you say?
I mean, it's relatively common. It's quite common for women poets, as I was saying, and this is true internationally. It's not necessarily just a Persian literature problem. The misattribution or non-attribution of poetry to women is a common thing the world over. But even for male poets in the Persian canon, we have this issue sometimes. Like some scholars believe, for example, the poetry of Khayyam, you know, they don't know if it's actually Khayyams, if Khayyam actually existed, if this was a thing. So even someone with the status of Khayyam, there are issues of attributions. It's not uncommon.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't have any other additional questions from the audience. I think a lot of people were perhaps a bit overwhelmed by all of the information, and I hope people will have plenty of time now to watch it on YouTube and digest it, think about it. If people want to know more information about this particular presentation on YouTube, there'll be a place where you can write comments, and we can then pass the comments on to the authors if people have particular questions to particular authors. And that's probably the easiest way to continue this particular dialogue. So I guess that's it today from the Corinne True Center for Baha'i Studies. I hope you can join us on April 6th, 2025, when Lex Musta will be speaking about parallel paths of service, the lives of Corinne True and Coralie Franklin Cook, who was an African-American Baha'i in Washington, D.C. The link to watch that is available on our website, CorinneTrueCenter.org. And we hope that you will join us then as well. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye until then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the very best.